The USA and China just extended their tariff pause for another 90 days. What's going on here, guys? Why can't these two countries figure out their trade deal? Well, I think there's a good reason for why they keep pausing, and we're going to get into that. Before we do, please make sure to like the video and also subscribe to the YouTube. Really appreciate your support. I'm also going to put a QR code down below for a Bitcoin tip. So if you want to support the channel, feel free to leave me a little tip. Now let's get into it. We got the news over the weekend, and I believe that it was maybe made official today on July 29th that the USA and China are extending their tariff pause for another 90 days. Now currently the USA does have tariffs on China and China does have tariffs on the US, but these tariffs are temporary. So currently the USA has a 30% tariff on Chinese imports, and China has a 10% tariff on imports from the United States. Now, let's get into the history of the tariffs this year a little bit here. Back in April, we got that Liberation Day announcement in early April from Donald Trump, where he basically announced these aggressive tariffs on the whole world. And we saw the USA and China really ramp up their tariffs on each other. I think it was initially that the USA tacked on an additional like 30% tariff on China, and then China raised their tariff on the US, and then they just kept raising each other up like a game of poker until the total tariff on China from the US was 145%. And the tariff on the US from China was 125%, which is pretty unrealistic, right? This is going to make it very expensive to trade with one another. It's really just not a good situation if both these countries are just taxing the hell out of each other. The USA and China are very dependent on each other, and for the past couple of decades, the relationship has kind of been that China is the world producer and the United States is the world consumer. So we see China produce a ton of stuff and they sell that stuff to the United States, right? And we see the United States for one, do a lot of their production in China, but we import a ton from China, and the United States has become very reliant on China. So China is not a fan of these tariffs because China wants to keep selling to the United States, the largest economy in the world. They want to keep that market open, and really, if China is to lose the United States as a customer, then they're going to be in trouble, right? They need access to produce and sell to this large economy. And then when we look at the United States has become so reliant on China. We produce so many of our goods and services, and we really get a ton of inputs from China. And one of the key inputs that we get from China are these rare earth minerals that are really used all throughout the US economy. They're used in electronics, they're used in auto, renewable energy, other types of energy, even defense. And this has become a big problem because China supplies 80% of the rare earth minerals for the US economy. So we don't really have a good way to access all these rare earth minerals that we need without China. So that's one area where the US is very dependent on China. We could also look at consumer electronics. You can think of a company like Apple who does a ton of their production in China. We also rely on China for the production of semiconductors and semiconductor components, which are really pivotal for this AI paradigm that we're kind of heading into and just for tech in general. And then you can think about things like consumer goods, clothing, a lot of the things that you buy at the store, right? These are made in China. So the US has become very reliant on China over the decades. The US is trying to flip the script. They're tired of being the world consumer, and now they're saying, hey, we want to be the world producer. We want to be selling to you guys. We want to be selling to China, but China isn't really on board with that, right? China wants to keep things how they are, and China wants to keep producing for the United States. And I really think that the US and our dependence on these rare earth minerals from China gives China a big upper hand, right? And when we saw this Liberation Day announcement and we saw these tariffs increased on China, we actually saw China impose export controls on these rare earth minerals to the US. So that's a big problem, right? If the US needs these rare earth minerals for our whole economy and we don't really produce them, then and we're reliant on China, then that puts us in a tough position. And maybe this is a good incentive for the US to start producing more of these rare earth minerals at home. Another way that the US is dependent on China is with US debt. China is the second largest foreign buyer of US treasuries, and the United States needs China to keep buying these US treasuries because if you don't know this, we have a big debt problem in the United States. The debt is continuing to grow, and as the supply continues to grow, the US is going to need to see foreign demand. Now, we have seen China ditching US treasuries over the past decade. I believe that sometime in the 2010s, China had around $1.3 trillion worth of US treasuries. And now I believe that China has around 700 billion to 800 billion in US treasuries. So China has been ditching US debt and buying gold. That is a big problem. If we see these large foreign entities ditching US treasuries, that's going to mean big problems for the United States and the dollar. So the United States does not want to piss off China to the point where China starts dumping their US debt. They would like for China to really up their US debt holdings, and we really need them to buy it. So the US needs to be careful in these trade talks with China. That is an upper hand that China has, right? They can dump more of their US Treasury holdings if the United States pisses them off. So this is a very delicate situation with the US debt and these foreign entities, and the US needs to make sure that they keep buying. To kind of wrap it up here, I think it's going to be difficult for these two countries to come to a trade agreement because it seems like they just want different things. The United States wants US entities, US businesses to stop producing in China for cheap and reshore, start producing more in the United States. And China doesn't want that, right? China wants to keep producing and selling to the United States. Now, the US can raise tariffs higher on China, but what is this going to mean for the US economy? Are these US businesses really going to reshore, or are they just going to pay this tariff tax, right? This tax on imports, and is that just going to hurt these US businesses? So the thing about tariffs is you kind of have to raise them a lot if you really want to incentivize these businesses to reshore. Because if you just have a 30% tariff, well, that's probably still going to be cheaper for these US businesses to just pay that and keep importing rather than move production back to the United States. You also think about the fact that if the US does try to raise tariffs higher on China, China kind of holds the cards. I just talked about how we get all our rare earth minerals from China, and also China can just raise tariffs back on the United States. If the US wants to flip from a world consumer to a world producer, they're going to need to have access to the Chinese market, right? That's the second largest economy in the world. So if China raises, tariffs on the US, these reciprocal tariffs, and the US can't sell to China, then it's going to be difficult for the US to really start becoming a production giant. And I think really this whole situation just highlights the difficulty in trying to transition and change the world order, right? We didn't even talk about how this affects global liquidity, right? Part of the reason for why the US needs to run a trade deficit is because they need to supply the world with dollars. So when we import from China, we take in their goods and services and their inputs, and we export dollars. And that allows, dollar liquidity to get around the globe, and it allows these different countries to exchange with the dollar as the reserve currency. So there are just like some really fundamental issues with trying to change from being this world consumer to this world producer. And the reality is that, if the US wants to do this, it's going to take time, right? We're not going to see reshoring overnight. It's going to take probably decades for the US to kind of flip the script here if they really want to go through with that. And it's also going to take restructuring, right? I don't think that the US is going to really become this world producer without us seeing a change to this dollar system that we're in. So I just think it's going to be difficult for these two countries to come to an agreement. I think the US is very reliant on China, but we will see what happens. I hope that they can come to an agreement. I think it's going to be tough. I think that we may see this pause possibly, extended again. That's going to wrap it up for this one. If you didn't like and subscribe, please make sure to do that now. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.